Are back with part 3 of this week's reading of the Messianic Jewish Family Bible, Tree of Life version. We have done Nahum and Habakkuk, and we're about to get into the book of Zephaniah. Now, Zephaniah, as I said, was only 3 chapters long. In Hebrew, Zephaniah means Adonai is hidden. Zephaniah lived during the reign of the revival of King Josiah, one of the greatest kings of Judah. Josiah led the nation in a great revival and returned to the authorized worship of God. It is not unreasonable to think that Zephaniah played some part in the short-term revival. Tragically, Josiah's revival seems to have been too short and too late. After his untimely death, the flames of worship flickered out and the torch of wickedness burned ablaze. God may indeed have seemed hidden to Judah, for just a few years later the nation was sacked, the capital was destroyed, and the people were uprooted, with the survivors taken captive to Babylon. Far removed from their ancestral homeland, many may have wondered where Adonai was. In this prophetic message, God shows himself to be anything but hidden. God speaks loud and clear to the nation about the coming judgment. Omnipotent, he is the one who allowed it. Zephaniah employs some of the same terminology as the prophet Joel, case in point, the day of Adonai. Questions about this day are answered in Zephaniah chapter 1, verses 14 to 19. Along with the promise of judgment, there is something new. Zephaniah gives the reason for the judgment and captivity. He informs that through the captivity and exile, the nation will become purified. All of God's efforts to get to and through to the nation of Israel failed. Reason, appeals, encouragement, and even threats did not work. Now it was time for action on God's part. The disciplined nation would be purified, the unrighteous separated out, and then a righteous remnant would be returned to the land. At the end of Zephaniah's prophecy, we see Israel restored and vindicated in the eyes of God and the eyes of the nations. God's judgment upon the Hebrews thus must not be construed as abandonment but discipline, temporary but not permanent. The second half of the book accentuates good news for Jews. God will not always reject his people, and God's will is, in fact, a general restoration to all nations. Israel's Messiah will be a principal agent in this restoration. In him, God has indeed made the way of salvation available to all people, Jews and Gentiles alike. So the name of Zephaniah means Adonai is hidden, and he lived during the time of the revival, during King Josiah's time. Now, the book of Zephaniah was written by Zephaniah. In the book, the central message of the book is the day of the Lord, or the wrath of a loving God. And again, Zephaniah, whose name means the Lord hides, or Adonai is hidden, was Zephaniah was the great grandson of King Hezekiah. And this prophet identified himself more than any other of the minor prophets. Zephaniah traced his genealogy back 4 generations to King Hezekiah, who was a good king who led the people during revival in Isaiah's time. Zephaniah gives more information about himself than any of the other prophets. Isaiah was also a contemporary and a distant relative of Zephaniah. The two prophets may have actually been friends. Both of them were equally zealous for the return to pure worship of the Lord, and Zephaniah was also a contemporary of Jeremiah. Both Joel and Zephaniah were prophets in Judah. So we see chapter 1 is the wrath of God upon Judah, where Zephaniah prophesied in Judah during the reign of King Josiah, probably before the Great Revival. And Zephaniah was stirred by the moral decline of Judah, and he foresaw the destruction and fall of the city. He had grown up in Jerusalem, and he was greatly troubled by prophesying the destruction of the great city. And everything in this chapter describes the wrath of God promised to bring on Judah because of the sins of the people. And judgment would come in the form of the Babylonian captivity. So, and we know what happened to the northern kingdom of Israel that fell to Assyria. And so that is basically chapter 1. When Josiah took over the reins of the government, the Assyrian threat was diminishing. Josiah was very instrumental in bringing about necessary reforms in Israel. Just to mention this as well. After a long silence, true prophetic voices were once again heard in Judah, and Zephaniah and Jeremiah cried out to the people against their sins. When the book of the law was found in the temple, King Josiah led a great revival in the nation. As a result, the land was purged from idolatrous practices, and the priests in the temples were cleansed. Passover was celebrated once again, and thousands of sacrifices were offered. Even though great reforms took place and the celebration of Passover was reinstituted, the hearts of the people were still not changed. The reform movement was an external movement and not the change of heart movement that was needed in Judah. The people had a false sense that everything was right with God, and therefore they kept on living in their sinful, complacent ways. It was in this atmosphere that the prophet Zephaniah blasted his prophecy. And a leading theme of the book of Zephaniah is the day of the Lord, a future event that the prophet described with vivid power. And Zephaniah used the term day of the Lord more than any other prophet. Yet he pleaded with Judah to seek the Lord that they might be saved in the day of the Lord's anger. And Zephaniah was appalled that after the catastrophe in the northern tribes, that the people of Judah still held on to the idea that God was helpless to do good or evil. Now, after the northern kingdom of Israel had been carried off to Assyria, the land was resettled by foreigners, and under the leadership of King Manasseh and King Amon, who was Josiah's father, the Jews paid tribute money to Assyria to keep them from invading Judah, the southern kingdom. The alliance with Assyria did affect Judah in many ways, socially, politically, and religiously. The magical arts of diviners and enchanters were practiced in Judah. Witchcraft and astral religions became so popular that King Manasseh erected altars for the worship of the sun, moon, stars, zodiac signs, and all hosts of heaven on the roof of the temple. And Manasseh was probably one of the worst kings in in the southern kingdom. He was actually the 14th king of the kingdom of Judah. And in chapter 2 of Zephaniah, we have the wrath of God upon the nations. Zephaniah then turned his attention to the nations that surrounded Judah. To the west he prophesied against Philistia and the Philistines. To the east he prophesied against Moab and Ammon. To the south Zechariah prophesied against Ethiopia. Then he prophesied to the north against Nineveh and the Assyrians. After that, Zechariah turned again to Jerusalem and warned the people that if God smote the nations for their sins, he would certainly smite Judah, the nation that enjoyed privileges from God above all other nations. And the final chapter of Zephaniah is from wrath to healing. And the prophet is not looking within for healing for Judah, neither is he looking without for healing for the nations. Instead, he is looking for a time beyond a time of healing and blessing for all nations. Zephaniah turned his attention to the coming Messianic kingdom that would embrace all nations as well as God's covenant people. At this time, according to the prophet, Israel would be made a praise among all the people of the earth. The day of the Lord is either the period of time or the actual day when God will bring his purposes to culmination for mankind and earth. God will reward the righteous with eternal blessings and will consign the wicked to eternal damnation. Amos was probably the first prophet to use the term the day of the Lord. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Obadiah, and Joel all speak of it as well. Even though the prophets were called by God to preach a dreadful message, they also reminded the people that wrath and judgment express only one side of God's nature. Like Habakkuk and others, Zephaniah reminded the people that God does remember, for he promises that he will purify and restore the faithful remnant. God assures his humbled people that no one else will ever make them afraid again, and that he will cast out their enemy. And he promises that he will gather his people and bring them back. He also will deal with the enemies of his people. And we're going to read now the 3 chapters of Zephaniah. Chapter 1, the hand of judgment upon idolaters. The word of Adonai that came to Zephaniah, son of Cushi, son of Gedaliah, son of Amariah, son of Hezekiah, in the days of Josiah, son of Amon, king of Judah. I will totally sweep away everything from the face of the earth, declares Adonai. I will sweep away man and beast. I will sweep away the birds of the sky and the fish of the sea. Also the stumbling blocks, the wicked. I will cut off mankind from the face of the earth, declares Adonai. I will stretch out my hand upon Judah and upon all the inhabitants of Jerusalem. I will cut off the remnant of Baal from this place, the names of the idolatrous priests, along with the Kohanim, those bowing those bowing down on the roofs to the host of the heavens, those bowing down, swearing to Adonai, and also swearing by Moloch. So Baal, Moloch, worshiping the host of heavens, that was all addressed here. Those turning from following Adonai, not seeking Adonai or consulting him. The day is at hand. Be silent before Adonai, for the day of Adonai is at hand. Adonai has prepared a sacrifice. He has consecrated his guests on the day of Adonai's sacrifice. I will punish the princes, the king's sons, and all who dress in foreign attire. In that day I will punish all who skip over the threshold while filling their master's house with violence and deceit. In that day, declares Adonai, there will be the sound of screaming from the fish gate, wailing from the second district, and a loud crash from the heights. Howl, inhabitants of Maktesh, for all the people of Canaan are destroyed. All who weigh out silver are cut off. At that time I will search Jerusalem with lamps and punish the men whose spirits have hardened, who say in their hearts, Adonai will do neither good nor evil. Their wealth will become plunder, their houses a ruin. They will build houses, but not live in them. They will plant vineyards, but not drink their wine. The great day of Adonai is near, and coming very quickly. The sound of the day of Adonai is bitter. The shouting of the warrior is there. The day is a day of wrath, a day of trouble and distress, a day of devastating storm and desolation, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and thick darkness, a day of shofar and alarm against the fortified cities and against the high corner towers. I will bring such distress upon mankind that they will walk like the blind, for they have sinned against Adonai. Their blood will be poured out like dust, and their flesh like dung. Neither their silver nor their gold will be able to rescue them on the day of Adonai's wrath. With the fire of his passion, the entire earth will be consumed, for he will make a total dreadful annihilation of all the inhabitants of the earth. That's the end of chapter 1. And this also sounds like the warning of the end times, too, as we're reading this. Chapter 2, Judgment of Nearby Nations. Gather together, O shameless nation, before the decree is brought forth, before the day passes away like chaff, before Adonai's burning anger comes upon you, before the day of Adonai's anger comes upon you. Seek Adonai, all you humble of the land, who have executed his judgment. Seek Adonai, all you humble of the land who have executed his judgment. Seek righteousness, seek meekness. Perhaps you will be hidden on the day of Adonai's wrath, for Gaza will be abandoned, and Ashkelon will be a wasteland. Ashdod will be driven out at noon, and Ekron will be uprooted. Oi to the inhabitants of the sea coast, the nations of the Cherethites. The word of Adonai is against you, Canaan, the land of the Philistines, and I will destroy you until there is no inhabitant. The sea coast will become pastures, with meadows for shepherds and folds for flocks. The coast will belong to the remnant of the house of Judah, upon which they will graze. In the houses of Ashkelon they will lie down in the evening, for Adonai their God will visit them and return them from captivity. I have heard the taunts of Moab, and the jeers of the children of Ammon, who taunted my people and expanded on their borders. Therefore, as I live, declares Adonai Sabaoth, God of Israel, Moab will be like Sodom, and Adam, Ammon like Gomorrah, a possession of weeds and a salt pit, a perpetual wasteland. The remainder of my people will plunder them; the remnant of my nation will dispossess them. This is what they will get for their pride, for they have taunted and expanded against the people of Adonai Sabaoth. Adonai will be fearsome against them, for all the gods of the earth will he will make waste away. To him he will to him will bow each from its place. The islands of the nations, you Ethiopians too will be slain by my sword. He will stretch out his hand against the north and devastate Assyria, and make Nineveh as a wasteland, dry as a desert. Flocks will lie down in her midst, all kinds of beasts. Both the little owl and the great owl will lodge in her pillars. A voice will hoot in the window. Ruin will be in the doorway, for the cedar beams will be exposed. This is the exultant city, dwelling securely, saying in her heart, "It's me, no one else but me." How did she become a ruin, an abode for wild beasts? Everyone who passes by her hisses and shakes his fist. And the final chapter is the downfall of disobedient Jerusalem. Oi to the oppressive city, filthy and defiled! She did not obey, she took no correction, she did not trust in Adonai, she did not draw near to her God. Her princes within her are roaring lions, her judges are wolves of the night, leaving nothing but bones for mourning. Her prophets are reckless, treacherous men. Her Kohanim have profaned what is holy. They do violence to Torah. Adonai is righteous in her midst. He will do no injustice. Morning by morning he brings his justice to light. He does not fail. Yet the unjust knows no shame. I have cut off nations. Their towers have become desolate. I have destroyed their streets with no one passing by. Their cities are laid waste with none living there. I said, surely you will fear me. You will accept correction. So her dwelling place would not be cut off. All that I appointed against her, but they arose early and made all their deeds corrupt. Therefore wait for me, declares Adonai, for the day when I rise up for plunder. For my decision is to assemble nations, to gather kingdoms, to pour out my fury upon them, all my burning anger. For in the fire of my wrath all the earth will be consumed. The future restoration of Israel's remnant. For then I will restore to the people pure speech, so that all of them may call upon the name of Adonai, and serve him shoulder to shoulder. From beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, my worshippers, the daughter of my scattered ones, will bring my offering. On that day you will not be ashamed because of all your deeds, by which you rebelled against me. For then I will remove from your midst your proud, arrogant ones, and you will never again be haughty on my holy mountain. But I will leave among you a people meek and humble. They will take refuge in the name of Adonai. The remnant of Israel will do no injustice, nor will they tell lies, nor will a deceitful tongue be found in their mouth. For they will graze and lie down, and no one will make them afraid. Sing aloud, O daughter of Zion. Shout in triumph, O Israel. Rejoice and exult wholeheartedly, O daughter of Jerusalem. Adonai has taken away your punishments. He has turned back your adversary. The King of Israel, Adonai, is in your midst. Never again will you fear harm. On that day it will be said to Jerusalem, have no fear, O Zion. Do not let your hands fall limp. Adonai, your God, is in your midst, a mighty Savior. He will delight over you with joy. He will quiet you with his love. He will dance for joy over you with singing. I will gather those among you who grieve over your Moedim. It is a burden of shame on you. Behold, at that time I will deal with all who oppress you. I will save the lame and gather the outcasts. I will make them a praise and a name throughout all the land where they suffered shame. At that time I will bring you in. At that time I will gather you, for I will give you renown and glory among all the peoples of the earth, when I restore your captives before your eyes, declares Adonai. And that is the end of Zephaniah. And then we're moving to the final book this week, and that is the book of Haggai. And Haggai's name means festival or celebration. Haggai was written after the Babylonian exile, and likely during the time of the first return of displaced Judean exiles under Zerubbabel in 536 BC. In 538 BC, the Babylonian king Cyrus issued an edict that all of the Jewish people could return home to Jerusalem, as could other peoples. Soon after, most of the Jewish people began their return back to Israel. The first group of returnees went back under the aforementioned Zerubbabel. Upon their return, the Jewish people found the city of Jerusalem and the temple in ruins. As they set out to rebuild the temple, Haggai records how the novelty of the enterprise had run its course, and how the people were then bested by their own sloth and indolence, not to mention perennial problems with the Samaritans. Tired, discouraged, and anxious to attend to their own estates, many of the Jewish people in and around Jerusalem were giving up the task of rebuilding, preferring instead to attend to their own private matters. Haggai's message was one of an encouragement to keep on rebuilding and to not give up on the task at hand. Haggai's message focuses much of its attention on the purpose of the temple in Jerusalem. The temple was to unite people with their God and allow for the reinstitution of the authorized worship of God. The rebuilding of the temple had been stated as the reason for the return to Babylon. It would be something of a low to have come all the way back to Israel and not rebuild the temple. Haggai wanted the nation to see the glory of the temple and all that it could be, envisioning as he did the proper worship was central to their success. As followers of the Messiah, we are drawn to the New Testament's portrayal of Yeshua at the dwelling place of God. John chapter 1, verse 14 says, "And the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. We looked upon his glory, the glory of the one and only from the Father, full of grace and truth." Yeshua's dwelling in us is similar to God's dwelling with Hebrews in the temple. In Yeshua, we see the fullness of God dwelling with man. Let us not be sluggish in attending to his development within us. So the book of Haggai was written by the prophet Haggai, and the message was about rebuilding the temple. And this is post-exilic, the post-captivity prophets. Haggai was one of them. Zechariah and Malachi were also post-exilic prophets. Haggai's name means festive. So we see the main appeal of Haggai, and also we're going to see it in Zechariah, was to inspire the Jews to complete the rebuilding of the temple, because they got discouraged and just stopped working on it and went about their own homes and their own businesses, and they did not bother with building the temple for a time. So Haggai dealt with a real problem that occurs in the life of God's people. It did not take long for the Jewish remnant that returned from captivity to fall into laziness, apostasy, sin, and neglect of their responsibility to rebuild the temple. Instead, the people built their own homes, forsook the building of the temple, and Haggai was encouraging them. I'm going to pause this here and come back with the next part.